Great. So hello, everyone. Really nice to see you through the text messages you've been putting in the chat there. My name is Carla Marschall, and I'm going to be presenting about concept-based inquiry today. As Sean already mentioned, I am a school leader, so I'm the director and CEO of Dresden International School. I've worked in a number of other countries, though. I've worked in, besides Germany, Switzerland, Hong Kong, Singapore for a number of years, and then I'm also from the US originally, so been kind of internationally around for the last 20 years. I'm an author of these two books. The one with the green cover here is the one that we're going to be thinking a little bit more about today, but I've also written one on issues-based learning, so if you're interested in thinking a bit more about how you can support student action in your classroom, then that would be one that you could think about looking at. I've currently worked with Oxford University Press on a position paper around concept-based inquiry for language learning, and that will be out in the next 3 or so months. So please keep your eye out for that. Oh, it already says download. So maybe it is actually available. I thought it was coming out a little bit longer. So yes, you can access it there. And I do write for other publications as well, like Edutopia. So if you're on that site, you can also find some of the articles that I've published. And I've always been told that when you're presenting, you should always give something to the people that are in your presentations that they can't Google. So I am left-handed. Left-handed females are only 1 out of every 10 left-handed people, and left-handed people are 1 out of every 10. So I'm 1 in 100. So maybe there's some other female left-handed people in our chat, and you have now that little fun fact. So what are our guiding questions for this session today? So first, we're going to think about what is concept-based inquiry and why is it a powerful form of pedagogy? How does it respond to the opportunities and challenges of the 21st century? You know, when I saw the countries that were where you're coming from today, I thought, you know, there's definitely different issues that are being experienced in all these different places, but there's also kind of a global issue that we're facing too, that we can connect to. And what does it look like in the classroom? So I'm going to try as much as possible to connect to classroom practice. I'm going to show quite a number of early years examples from 5, 6, and 7-year-olds because we know that young children are doing language acquisition at the same time as they are also learning content in our classrooms. And so I will show some early years examples to try to connect to that. So we're going to start though with a little provocation, which is to think a little bit more about what the world is like today. So here you can see some images. I'm going to go clockwise, starting from the image with the VR headsets. We have a VR headset. Then we have a protest, a Black Lives Matter protest. Then on the far right, at the top, we have a refugee camp. Then at the bottom there, on the right, we have pollution in the ocean. And then in the middle at the bottom, we have kind of an image of the sky in a forest fire. I'd like you to think about what the world is like today and try to use some adjectives and put those in the chat. So we'll take about 30 seconds to see what comes up. I'm already starting to see things like hectic, tech-driven, insecure, challenging, crowded, globalized. There's quite a number of very strong adjectives here around chaos. So that's quite interesting to see that. Complicated was something I saw, modern, changing. So absolutely, those things are all connected to what we would describe as Vuca. And you might have heard of this acronym before, which is that we describe the world as being volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I think we saw this quite a lot in COVID because it was the first time when we were really able to see the interconnectedness between a lot of our systems. So our health systems were connected to our transport systems, flights stopped, or they were almost empty, or it was really difficult to travel. Our medical system was connected to the education system. We had lockdowns, students couldn't go to school, it all needed to shift to online. The medical system was connected to our supply chains. So it was hard to get, you know, toilet paper or certain goods and services that we weren't used to having. And so it allowed us to really see how through the complexity of globalization and our interconnected world, we really do have a very volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous context for our learners. And I believe that with increased globalization, that will only increase for our learners. And so one question we need to ask ourselves is, as teachers, what kind of pedagogy can support our students in navigating these conditions? We want to prepare them as well as possible for this complex world. And so what does that look like? When we look at some of the feedback from organizations, this is from the World Economic Forum, there are some things that they say about the top skills of 2025. And I'm sorry that it's a little bit hard to read here, but we have things like the blue icons are all problem solving. So the top one, number one, is analytical skills. Then number two is around active learning and learning strategies. That means that as people move into employment, they're able to continue to learn. They're able to continue to expand their knowledge and understanding of the world, and perhaps also change whatever their job was into a related sector if through innovation and technology, something changes. So you can see that those top 5 skills, 4 of them are around problem solving, and the green there is around self-management. If you're interested in being able to learn more about this, just put into Google World Economic Forum top 10 skills of 2025, and you'll be able to see a little bit more. Then we also have research specifically done with students, which really helps us see what their perspective is. It shouldn't just be from kind of think tanks, but we should also really hear from learners. The WISE Foundation in Qatar, they did a study with 9,500 students age 16 to 25, so kind of older adolescents moving into early adulthood. And they were from 20 different countries. So it was very much a broad sweep of the world. It wasn't just one particular nation context. And they asked these kids, do you feel that your generation has a responsibility to improve the world? And 87% of learners said, yes, we absolutely do. At the same time, they were asked, do you feel prepared to be able to take action and find solution to big societal issues? And when they were asked that, only 37% of girls and 48% of boys claimed that they were able to do so. So there's a disconnect between our educational systems and perhaps what students aspire to be able to do and what we're seeing from the world of work in terms of the skills that are required to be successful. So what does this mean for us as teachers? The first thing, and I think this has come up a lot in the chat, I saw people writing flexibility, flexible, those kinds of words, that recall and memorization alone do not provide the cognitive flexibility that students need to be successful in today's world. Even though memorization is very, very important for learning languages, right? We have to learn vocabulary, we have to learn conjugation, we need to learn structures of language. At the same time, we need it to be more than that. And we need to create thinking classrooms. So what does this mean? It means that in our classrooms, we're able to support the development of dispositions that are required for deep thinking. So for instance, we need students to be open-minded. They need to be able to see something new and then reflect on their prior learning and think about if they need to change their understanding. They need to be able to be evidence-minded. They need to draw from facts, from case studies, from examples that they've seen, and use that as evidence to create big ideas that transfer to new situations and contexts. And connecting to that idea of learning to learn, we need students who are persistent, which means that they try something, it might not work, they try again, and they have that resilience to be able to manage a complex context, whether that be in the language classroom or out in the world. So concept-based inquiry is really about bringing these ideas together in a framework. And we've used a Venn diagram here. So my co-author, Rachel French, and I We started working on this kind of 2016, 2017. We both were working with teachers as curriculum coordinators, and we realized that there wasn't a framework that supported our teaching staff that we were working with to move from the level of the classroom practice up to big ideas, that they might have understood it very philosophically, but they needed some concrete support with thinking about what it looked like in the classroom. So this framework brings together two concepts. The first is inquiry-based learning, which is all about using questions to support learning. That means student questions, and it also means teacher questions. It doesn't mean that it's only moving to student questions. Teachers can also ask really powerful questions that get students thinking. The second part of this is concept-based learning, and that means of course we need to teach facts, of course we need to teach skills, but that's not enough. We need to make sure that we have overarching big ideas that we're supporting our learners in understanding so that they can take that information and be able to apply it to new situations and contexts. And in terms of what the World Economic Forum was saying, when we think about inquiry-based learning, our students are learning all those learning to learn skills, they're developing curiosity, they have an intellectual engagement because instead of us telling, then they're exploring questions. And of course, they have that perseverance because they have to try to find an answer to something that might be a little bit difficult for them. And in terms of concept-based learning, it's all about that critical thinking, analysis, and synthesis. We're helping our kids be able to look at the facts and then be able to see patterns across that to develop big ideas. And I will show a little bit more what this means in this session. So right now it might sound a little bit abstract. I will show what this looks like for young learners too. So I just want to do another little active engagement with you, which is really about thinking about this word concept, because we hear it used in a lot of contexts and it's very abstract. So when you think about the word concept, can you please name a concept you know and what you think makes it a concept? So what would be some criteria? So for example, I saw someone in the chat put the word innovation. So I could put the idea of innovation and I might say something like, well, that's a concept because there have been various examples of innovation from 3,000 years ago with the Chinese or with Egyptians building the pyramids. And of course we have innovation now. So think about one concept you know and what makes it a concept. Try to think about those specific criteria. And I'll just wait and see what people put into the chat. So I saw someone put artificial intelligence, hierarchy, the idea of perspective or structure, sustainability, religion, absolutely, because there's different versions of religion, different examples of that, citizenship, innovation, freedom, absolutely. These are all amazing examples of concepts. Adaptation, creativity, culture, democracy, absolutely. So you're right on the right track. And if we add a little bit of meat on the bones of what you're describing there as great examples of concepts, I'm going to give you some criteria now to better understand what we mean by this. So when we talk about concepts, what we mean are mental constructs drawn from a topic or a process that transfer to new situations and contexts. And we can think of these as being transferable, timeless, universal, represented by different examples, and abstract to various degrees. So we had some people talk about adaptation. Well, adaptation with humans and adaptation with animals, that looks very different, but they both share common attributes. They're both timeless. There's been adaptations with the dinosaurs in the past, and there's adaptations now with humans in figuring out how to manage climate change. So that is an example that shows the transferability, timeless, and universal nature of concepts. Topics, on the other hand, are groups of connected facts. They're locked in time, place, and situation. So they're often very concrete. And as I mentioned before, they do not transfer. So as I mentioned, adaptation might be your concept, but dinosaurs might be your topic because it's locked. There's no dinosaurs now, right? As we all know. So we can really think about concepts as being a bridge. I love this. This is from Eleanor Roche. She's actually done a lot of work with cognitive psychology, and she talks about concepts as being a natural bridge between the mind and the world. Concepts are the way that we take the complexity of the world and we put it into an abstract idea, which then can be applied over and over and over again to different situations and contexts. It's really a sense-making tool for us to engage in the world. And that's why it's so important that we develop concepts in our learners. I'd like to give you another chance to just think about which of these might be concepts or topics and why. You don't have to write it in the chat, but we have some words here like transitions, hiking, Diwali, rhyme, leisure, slang, time expressions, register, celebration, and limerick. And I want you to think about if some of these are concepts and some of these are topics, which would they be and why? So I'll just give you maybe 5 or 10 seconds to have a look there. I can see some people putting some ideas in there about Diwali being a topic. I saw someone say celebrations would be a concept. Here are the answers. So the blue ones are concepts, and the black ones or dark blue ones are topics. And you can see actually that these are connected. So slang is an example or topic that connects to register, right? Because slang is a very informal register. Limerick is a type of rhyme. Diwali is an example of a celebration. Time expressions are a way that writers or speakers can do transitions in their language. Hiking is an example of leisure. And so we have these relationships between topics and concepts. When we teach conceptually, it doesn't mean that we get rid of topics because they provide the foundation for that really big abstract thinking that we want for our learners. And we also want to make sure that we do this at different levels of specificity. And we call this micro and macro concepts. So you can see here the nesting dolls, and that you have smaller and smaller dolls inside the large doll. The idea here is that you have very large concepts, things like voice in language, and you have more and more specific examples of that, which provide disciplinary depth. And so when we're working with our learners, of course, we want to develop those big ideas. And a lot of the concepts you mentioned would be those macro concepts, things like creativity or structure or freedom, really broad concepts. But we also want to make sure that we're going very deep with our learners and describing more micro concepts like narrator or debate as a form of persuasive text. Let's see. So, oops, there we go. So what does this look like in the classroom? Here you can see 5-year-olds, and they're in a unit that's about animal features. And here what they're doing is they're looking at little pictures of different animals, and they're deciding if that picture shows whether or not it's an example or a non-example of the concept of feature, because feature is a very abstract word, right? Animal feature in particular. So there you can see the relationship between topics and concepts, that we use those examples to help learners be able to understand concepts more deeply. Likewise, we always use this idea of examples and non-examples and comparing attributes to be able to help students move from the factual level, where we have that strong foundation to our topic that we might be teaching in the classroom, to more abstract levels of thinking. And here you can actually see that this can be done by the students. So this was a unit where students were learning about what makes a performer, and they were doing a performance. So the teacher asked them to all draw an example of a performance that they had either been to or seen. And here you can see on the right-hand side, this is someone dancing Swan Lake, I believe. And then on the right-hand side, it's someone who's wearing a mask. That's why it looks like there's 2 heads there, and they're singing, and they're in front of an audience. And the teacher then used this to draw out what makes a performer, which is very abstract as an idea for a 6-year-old. So I'm showing this because when we're talking about concept-based teaching, it's really important that we think of concepts as being in a very strong relationship with our factual knowledge that we're teaching students, whether that be the skills that relate to processes such as the reading process or the writing process, or facts that may be drawn from topics such as around culture, leisure, family, things which are common topics that we might have in the language classroom. And so we always want to be thinking about, as teachers who are developing big ideas in students, I'm teaching this particular topic. Which concepts am I going to draw out for my learners to make sure that they have that transferable understanding by the time that they leave this particular period of time with you? So how does this connect to language learning? You might be listening to this and thinking, yes, but I'm a language teacher. My kids might have very low proficiency levels. They're not, fluent yet. So what does this mean? And basically, if we take the framework around BICS and CALP from Jim Cummins, we can start to see the relationship between concept-based teaching and learning and language learning. So he talks about basic interpersonal communication skills, which is, when our students can have conversational use of the language. They can say, can I go to the toilet? They can order at the restaurant what they would like to eat. They can have a conversation about what they did with their friend on the weekend. That's the language of everyday situations. And we know from Cummins research that it takes roughly 2 to 3 years in order for students to acquire BICS, or basic interpersonal communication skills. But then we also want to make sure that we're developing CALP, which is cognitive academic language proficiency. And this is a very, very strong indicator of school success. The stronger the CALP in our learners, the more likely they are to be successful in their school life. And this is because the cognitive academic language proficiency is connected to disciplinary learning, specific concepts and vocabulary across the disciplines. And it's also the language of abstractions. It's the language of concepts. This is when students are using language to talk about ideas, when they're talking about politics or literature or a piece of artwork, and they're using very specific vocabulary to be able to do so. And we know that CALP takes roughly 5 to 7 years to develop in learners, depending on their developmental age and stage. And so when we're thinking about concept development, what we're actually doing is thinking very intentionally about CALP learning for our students. I'm multilingual. My first language is English, but I'm fluent in German. I would say my German's probably a C1, maybe on the border of C2. And I know that I definitely use my English literacy skills to be able to support my speaking in German. I'm also now beginning to learn Japanese. And unfortunately, I can't use my knowledge in German to be able to do that. And that is because of the fact that languages have different surface features, right? So in German, we have all these declensions. The adjectives change depending on whether or not you're describing the object, the subject, the indirect object. And so that's one way that they have decided to structure their language, which is very different to Japanese, where, for example, some of the language features there are often you leave the subject out of the sentence. You have adjectives where the endings change because you're using it in the past tense instead of a present tense format. And so, unfortunately, I cannot use my German to help me with the Japanese learning. However, Cummins talks about CUP, or common underlying proficiency. And this is really how we use the underlying processes of learning language, critical thinking, literacy, to be able to support us in learning an additional language. So I can say, for example, in German, there's a lot of compound nouns, right? And that is something that I can use my understanding of parts to be able to put together a whole. I can look at a large word that might be made up of 2 or 3 different words, and using my understanding of those 3 individual words, I can understand that larger whole. I can use that same literacy strategy when I'm trying to understand a word in Japanese, which is written with a specific kanji that means something like flower or sun, I can use that to try to understand the whole. So actually, when we develop our students' underlying proficiency, as well as those surface features of the language, we really support them in developing the critical thinking skills that are going to support them later in life. So I'm going to give an example of this. So this is, again, 5-year-olds. I know it's a little bit small, so I'm going to describe what's happening here in the picture. The teacher at this school, which is an international school in Germany with a very high level of students with English as a second or a third language, she has big books, so large-scale books that she uses for all of her units. And what she did here is this unit was all about organization. And what she asked the kids to do was to take photos at home of examples of organization. And they went around, and you can see here are some shoes. I've got it written down because it's even hard for me to read when it's this small. So one child said, I put my shoes away when I take them off. So that's one organization strategy used at home. Or this one, I put my plate in the dishwasher. Or this one, my mommy rolls up my clothes and puts them in my drawer, so it makes it easier for me to find them. So there, the teacher has written using Bics, right? Very common language coming from the child, what their everyday experience has been. But then what she did in the classroom to develop larger conceptual understandings is she said, what do we see across these green examples? Because she thought very intentionally about the understanding she wanted to develop. What do we see that's common across these ideas? And then she helped them to develop a large idea that had much more abstract language. And this is different people take responsibility for helping to keep things organized. So I'd like you to think about here, which specific language skills or language structures and thinking skills do you see being learned in this example with 5-year-olds? Thinking about what we just learned about with Bics and CALP and the common underlying proficiency, what are some things that you see in terms of language skills, structures, and thinking skills? I'm just having a look. So someone talked about present tense. So present simple tense verbs. Yes, absolutely. Prepositions of place. Great. And then other people talking about those higher level thinking skills, observation skills, critical thinking. Absolutely. So what this example shows is that by supporting students in moving from their factual level, these routines that they have at home, something that they can connect to very closely, and then allowing them opportunities to analyze and synthesize across those with some very strong scaffolding from the part of the teacher, she could actually introduce very abstract language which supports their CALP development. So when we teach students conceptually, what we do is we build upon that common underlying proficiency, but we allow for stronger reasoning, problem solving, and literacy in doing so. So we build the thinking skills and the language skills in tandem. And we do that through these particular strategies in the classroom, being really intentional about how we're using our factual content to be able to build to big ideas. So what does this look like as a process? Basically, when we talk about concept-based inquiry, we try to use an inductive approach. And you can see that here in the top row of this slide. So essentially what we do is we give children lots of factual examples, and then we say, what patterns do you notice when we're doing this? And then from that, they can form those big ideas or those generalizations. And we could see that in this particular example with the kindergarten, that these are the particular examples. They're creating them themselves. And then what she's doing is she's saying, how do they connect? What patterns do you see? And then they're able to generalize from that. And this differs a little bit to what we would call a deductive approach, where we give children the rule and then we give them some examples and then they figure out how these two things connect. Of course, sometimes we will use a deductive approach. It is not kind of like an either or. We have to be very flexible as teachers to think about when is it the best time to use a particular strategy. And if, for example, if there is a grammar rule that is really difficult for students to generalize from some examples from, then we may give them the rule. However, when we're trying to develop that critical thinking, synthesis, analysis skills, it's important that we have those opportunities for induction. And I'll show an example of what this looks like again. This is with a foreign language teacher who is teaching Spanish. I'm sorry that the slide is small. I'm going to read parts out to you. So this was a Spanish unit where the children who were not native speakers of Spanish, they were learning Spanish, were learning about migration as a concept. And they were looking across various examples of Spanish-speaking countries. So they were looking at Spain and Mexico and Peru and Ecuador and other Spanish-speaking countries. And then what they did is on these yellow Post-it notes, they wrote examples that they had found out, information that they had found out from these different contexts. And the teacher asked them to try to put them into categories. So some of the categories that they put here were things like laws and rules, and how laws and rules are different for different kinds of migrants, depending on their situation, their lifestyle and quality of life. There was a section on refugees. And then what she asked them to do was to create a big idea based on what they learned from these different topics. And they decided to come up with the big idea. The profiles of immigrants are diverse, and to change their political and social conditions, people need to understand their different needs. So when we have a real process where we ask students to say what they understand at the factual level, to group them in some kind of way to see patterns, then they can actually develop this really strong higher level thinking skills. But it really comes from this very strong scaffolding from the teacher. I see someone putting in the chat, which is the best method to teach grammar, deductive or inductive? I probably would say, Teresita, that it depends on what you're trying to teach and how easy it is to generalize from examples you could give to the children. So in terms of the process, Rachel French and I developed an inquiry model to be able to try and show what the process might look like to develop conceptual understanding with students. So when we talk about kids writing that big idea, such as these children did in the Spanish classroom up at the top here, what we're talking about is them generalizing this blue triangle here on the left-hand side. However, we can't just give them content and say, so what's the big idea, right? We have to scaffold it for them so that they have deep understanding first. So we go through a process of engagement where we get them to think about what do they already know. We may front load some vocabulary if we have students that need to access content through vocabulary development. We would develop some concepts that we think are important for them to understand in the study. Then they would investigate, and this means maybe they develop knowledge of particular examples, but then also particular skills that are required in a unit. Organization here, the purple triangle, is really that part where students look at what they've learned so far, they start to look for patterns, and then they're able to then answer a conceptual question up to be making a big idea. Transfer, the red triangle, is really about them taking that idea that they've made. For example, in Spanish, the idea that the profiles of immigrants are different, and in order to change conditions, you need to look at the understanding. You need to understand the different needs of different migrant groups. You'd say, okay, great. Now you understand that. Now let's take some other new context where we have immigrants. How does this apply? And that would be kind of the ability for them to apply that in some new situation or context. It could be from the news, could be from a video, could be an application of learning. So it really just depends what you would like to do as a teacher. And that could extend even beyond a unit. You know, it could be 2 or 3 or 4 months later, you see something that applies to that learning you've done previously, and you could bring it back into the classroom and say, how does this connect? So even in this session, when I was constructing it, I was really trying to think about how I could use this inquiry model with you. I was thinking about, well, I want to engage your prior knowledge. You all have such different experiences. I saw people from Korea, Japan, Morocco, Poland, Kyrgyzstan, Peru, Argentina. You all have such different contexts. And unless I think about how I can engage your schema, what's in your mind from your prior experiences, it's going to be really difficult for me to bring you with me on this particular webinar. So I did an engagement strategy with you, and then I actually did a focus strategy, which was I was helping you to understand what we mean when we say concept, so that you could better engage with this webinar. I would like you to think about, from your own teaching, how can you connect to this model? What are things that you feel that you're doing maybe frequently in your classroom? What are things that maybe feel new to you? Just take a moment and write some ideas in the chat. So Olympia was saying that the transfer part is what shows us if students really understand or not, and if they can put to use what they've learned in the classroom. Absolutely. I see some people putting engage or engage and focus. I think that means that those are things that you feel you can connect to. I see some people putting scenario-based learning. Absolutely. You could use scenarios in a concept-based inquiry because scenarios are all about managing complexity. People saying transfer is challenging. Absolutely. We have to be very conscientious about how we provide bite-sized opportunities for students to transfer that don't feel too complex for them. And so part of that is really being intentional about what we want students to understand, and then looking for the right moment where we can transfer to a new situation or context. Someone said they frequently use deduction methods for vocabulary learning. Yep. So sometimes we might use deduction. Sometimes we'll use induction to support more of that conceptual thinking. Great. So what I want to talk a little bit about now is the fact that sometimes when we see something like this framework, we might think automatically, oh, I need to learn a whole bunch of new strategies. I have to kind of like throw the baby out with the bathwater, as the saying goes. And that's absolutely not true. There are many strategies that you use as language teachers that help you to develop concepts. And that's really the next kind of big idea in this webinar, which is I put here EAL strategies. That's because for us in a school, we talk about English as an additional language because we have so many multilingual learners. You might use the term ESL or another acronym, but really many of these strategies support concept formation because they build the cognitive, academic, language proficiency needed to think abstractly about ideas. So when we're thinking about our strategies, we need to think about how we can develop concepts with them. So one that is a very, very common strategy that you will use in the classroom is the Frere model. Now, the Frere model was developed by Nancy Frere and her colleagues at the University of Wisconsin. It was actually meant as an English learning strategy. So the idea with the Frere model is that you put the concept in the middle, and you may or may not give a student's definition or characteristics, and then they can think about examples and non-examples. So for example, if we were going to take the idea of innovation, as I mentioned that earlier in this webinar, then we might have examples here such as the building of the pyramids of Giza, maybe something having to do with AI. So we could be looking at examples across time. We could think about non-examples being something more of that iterative innovation, like or iterative change, something like maybe a new kind of tire came out for a car, but it's actually not really any different. It just perhaps has a different kind of tread. So we would want to give our students those examples and non-examples, characteristics and definitions to be able to develop a concept. So this is actually an English language strategy. It's actually quite old now. I think it was the 1960s or 1970s that it was developed, but it's still an excellent strategy for developing concepts in the classroom. Now, I saw someone say unrealistic, that maybe this sounds like it's a little bit tricky to do in the classroom. What I would like to share is that when you're working on a strategy like this, and then thinking more conceptually about your units in the classroom, you can be developing concepts even if it's part of a unit that you've been doing for years. So very commonly in the classroom, in the language classroom, we will be using strategies like, we'll be thinking about topics such as family, leisure, culture, celebrations. These things come up very, very frequently in the language classroom. So instead of it teaching it topically, what we can do is take that idea of culture or celebration or family, and we can use something like the Frere model to look at it conceptually instead. And what we also would like to do in the language classroom is encourage our students to use their writing skills to actually write down and record their big ideas. So here you can see a grade 2 classroom. Again, I'm trying to use a lot of early years examples because in early years, they're doing the development of language just as much as they are developing content. And this teacher was teaching 2 units. One was a fractions unit, and then the next was a unit on subtraction and addition. And she invited the students to write their big ideas themselves, and they're completely in student speak. So I'm just going to read out some of them. I've written them down in my notebook. So you see me looking down, that's what I'm doing. So one of the children wrote, the bottom of the fraction represents the number of pieces. So this is not complex language, but it represents a big idea and has some very specific vocabulary, such as fractions or pieces. They're not using the words denominator and numerator, right? They're using language that's appropriate for grade 2 students. So they were able to record that big idea and then put it up on the wall. Or for addition, they said addition is the opposite of subtraction, right? So they're developing sentences using their writing skills, representing their big ideas. And then because the writing has a purpose, which is that we're recording our classroom ideas, then they're also more motivated because they know that their peers are going to see their thinking too. So we want to make sure that we provide those opportunities for students to record the thinking process. They can have opportunities to go back to these big ideas and then say, well, is that always true? Would you add on to it? Would you change your idea now? And it allows us to facilitate transfer, because then we can say, oh, that's really interesting that you said that addition is the inverse of subtraction. Let's look at another, example from this particular unit and see if it's still true. Amrita has said these strategies could be used for a PYP exhibition. So yes, absolutely. If you're in an IB school and you're using any of the International Baccalaureate programs, these are also very, very appropriate for that curriculum. Okay, so I want to make sure that I give you some time to ask some questions and I can answer those for you. But I want to come back to our guiding questions for our session. Because once again, when we're talking about concept-based inquiry, we want to be using questions. And in this case, I didn't have the time for you to be able to craft your own questions to be able to answer. So I have some guiding questions. So the first one was, what is concept-based inquiry and why is it a powerful form of pedagogy? And the answer to that is, well, what it does is it allows us to use powerful questioning with the development of big ideas. We want students to be able to walk away from their learning feeling that sense of intellectual engagement, curiosity, perseverance, as well as having the analytical and synthesis skills to be able to create big ideas that transfer. How does it respond to the opportunities and challenges of the 21st century? Well, we're developing that cognitive academic language proficiency, which is really important for success in school and for success across the disciplines. But we're also developing the common underlying proficiency and the thinking skills that are required for a changing world. Critical thinking, literacy that transfers across languages. And what does it look like in the classroom? So we have intentional repurposing of our strategies that we use as language teachers to develop concepts and conceptual understandings. And we build from the level of the facts. So it's not about throwing anything out. It's just about that slight tweak and about our intention as teachers, knowing that we want students to move towards particular big ideas. So I'm going to have a look now at the Q&A, and as I imagine, there'll probably be lots of questions, and I can't answer all of them in the next 10 minutes, but I'm going to try to answer as many as I can.
You just click on the Q&A tab, Carla, and then there are a number of questions. Yeah, just make sure you've kind of scrolled to the top of it, because sometimes it's automatically scrolled down, but there are a fair few in there for you to deal with. Let me know if you need any help.
Okay. What concepts can we use properly for English foreign language students where the learner's mother tongue is not English? So I think the answer to that is basically that you can use any concepts that are developmentally appropriate for the age of the child, as long as you go through a process of scaffolding from facts and making sure that there is sufficient foundation there. When you think about the 5-year-olds in that unit around organization, they were using vocabulary such as sorting, organization, responsibility. These are highly abstract concepts. The majority of the children in that classroom had home languages other than English. So it's more about the process that we take as teachers to be able to develop that academic language over time than it is necessarily about the concepts. Of course, a 5-year-old needs to have certain concepts to be able to understand other concepts. We don't do things like square root with kids who are 5 because they need to understand numbers and simple operations first. So we also need to think about the developmental appropriateness of the concepts based on the age and the stage of our learners. Okay, let's look at another question. So as a language educator, what is the best method in teaching grammar, deductive or inductive? Again, I would say it depends what you're trying to develop. So as I mentioned before, I'm trying to learn Japanese, and part of Japanese learning is around kanji and developing your understanding of how kanji is used and replaces hiragana in a sentence. Now, part of that is going to be deductive, because I need to know like the radical in that kanji, the part of it that says that this particular kanji has something to do with water. But then I might use that inductively when I'm exploring new kanji, such as the kanji for fish or the kanji for rain. So I might use both deductive and inductive methods to be able to better understand something. And as teachers, we need to think about which is going to be best for whatever the situation or context. So I would say there's no hard or fast rules. We need to be making the best choices based on, again, our students' prior knowledge, what we're trying to achieve, what they did in the prior unit, how we can build on that knowledge over time. There was a question, can a concept also be a topic? So that's a very interesting question from Paul. So sometimes what we say is that mathematics in particular is a conceptual language. And so everything you would talk about in mathematics, like subtraction, addition, shape and space, data handling, these are already concepts, but we treat them as topics in the mathematics classroom. So often in mathematics, we go straight from examples right to the level of a concept and to a big idea. But generally, if we're looking at things in the language classroom, we have particular skills that we develop, and then we would use those skills to draw out big ideas about how the skills are used intentionally by language speakers or writers or readers. How would you transpose concept-based learning to adult education? This one is from Nancy. So when I lead workshops, I will use the inquiry cycle to be able to structure the way that I lead that workshop. So as I mentioned today, the first few things that you did were right along the inquiry model in terms of engaging your prior knowledge, maybe giving you some excitement about the workshop because we're thinking more generatively about what the world is like today, and then also providing an opportunity for concept formation by looking at the difference between a topic and a concept. So I would use that same cycle in working with educators. I would even go so far as to articulate the big ideas that I would want learners to develop, whether they're students in the classroom or educators, by the time that they're done with a particular workshop. Okay, Rania has asked if we could highlight the difference again between deductive and the inquiry method. So I think maybe what I would do, Sean, is it possible for me to go back to my slides? Yes, right? I'm going to go back to that slide just so that we can talk through it a little bit more. Okay, so when we're talking about deductive and inductive, we don't necessarily need to think about which is better suited to inquiry or not, because you can use both of them in an inquiry cycle, but for different purposes. So the idea with inductive is that I give you a lot of examples. I might ask you to look at Halloween, because that's next week, Diwali, maybe something of, Eid, some other celebrations in other parts of the world. And I have different groups looking at those different celebrations. And then I might say, what do you notice that's the same across all of these celebrations? And then you would form a big idea. Now, that is an example of the inductive approach. But if you did every single part of grammar, sentence structure, and everything through induction, the kids would be overwhelmed, right? So we have to very intentionally choose when we're going to use induction and when we're going to use deductive approaches, where we might say, okay, so we are going to do some conjugation. We're going to be looking at this from the present to the simple past. I'm going to give them the rule. Then I'm going to give them 5 verbs that are not irregular verbs, that are just regular verbs. And then they're going to see how that rule works. So we don't necessarily say in an inquiry, we only have to use one kind of teaching, right? We can mix and match because it's all about the art of teaching. It's about choosing what's best for our learners. But sometimes we will definitely choose the deductive approach when we feel that an inductive approach is going to overwhelm our learners based on their background and experiences, what they know so far, how much time you have in the unit, and all that. So yeah, it's really just about intentional choices that we make as educators. Okay, let's go down and see. I'm kind of focused on the top, and I want to make sure I get to some of them at the bottom. How do we avoid rote method for concept-based understanding? That's from Sobas. So there is nothing wrong with some rote learning if, for example, it helps students to be able to better understand something better or to be able to put it to memory. So I'll give an example. One of my sons is grade 4, right? And in grade 4, they learn their multiplication tables because that's kind of when you have that expectation that they get up to 10 times 10. So what we want to avoid is that grade 4 kids only learn through the rote method. So they're learning 5 times 5 and 6 times 6 and 3 times 4. And all they're doing is memorizing it, because actually the brain seeks meaning through connection. So if we want to have a better outcome with our rote learning, what we do is we build that on a scaffolding of understanding. So they might be using objects first to model multiplication. They might use arrays to be able to show different squares that represent different multiplication sums. And after they've done some of that conceptual learning, then we take out the flashcards and say, now you understand multiplication. Now you're going to practice. And we might do the same thing with language structures. So we might give them some opportunities to look at texts and to better understand how something happens in language, and then ask them to apply a rote method to memorize something that they have a deep understanding about. Okay, I'll go to another question. I feel like I'm talking a lot, but I know that this is about answering questions. So hopefully people are finding it useful. How many macro concepts do you teach per unit? Do you always connect to micro to macro, or macro to micro? And how do you strike a balance? That's an excellent question from Douglas. So in terms of how we plan concept-based units, what we would do is we would have, start with a big sheet of paper. We would think about what our unit is about. Let's say our unit is about celebrations, because we've talked about that. And what we would do is we would think about the different language areas we'd be teaching through our celebrations unit. Perhaps we're going to ask our students to do some interviews of people in our community. So we're going to be having a strong focus on oral language. We might have them do some presentations, which would be visual language. And so maybe we have quite a number of concepts that are underneath those areas of the unit. Then we can also think about what are the big concepts that will be drawing together the unit, and those would be more of the macro concepts. We might choose one large one that goes across all the different strands of our unit or the parts of our unit, or we might choose, 2 or 3. But we probably wouldn't choose too many, because macro concepts tend to be very, very abstract, and it's much harder for students to understand them without sufficient unpacking. So probably we would only take 1 to 3. But you would have tons and tons of micro concepts in a unit. And how do you know about the balance? Well, really you want to make sure that when you're working on strands of a unit, that you have sufficiently unpacked that content, that you know that there's specific skills you want to develop. And then you start thinking about, well, what's the big idea of those skills, to start thinking about more broad concepts that you would develop. So for example, I mentioned presentation skills. So you might develop the idea of a presentation, visual literacy, using micro concepts such as structure as your large concept, and more specific concepts like layout, font, or text, the difference between negative and positive space on your slide, background, things like that. So you'd want to make sure that you're doing that throughout your strands, as well as looking at it as a holistic unit. In the book, there's a whole chapter on unit planning. It's very hard to talk about that for just 1 or 2 minutes. So I would suggest for anyone who's interested in starting to think about how they can plan their units more conceptually, that you take a look at concept-based inquiry in action. I probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions. I'm going to see if I can find something slightly different. Roxana talks about, how does this differ and contribute to the communicative approach? I love this question. So we know that communicative approach is really, really successful in supporting the fluency of our students. What we want to do is connect the communicative approach to those broader concepts. And so what we can do is we can have students be using and applying their language skills, and at the same time develop some awareness of what they're doing in that application. And that's really where the conceptual understandings come in. So I've worked with teachers in Singapore, for example, who were Chinese teachers, and they were thinking about how they could use the communicative approach to support students in doing the maximum amount of speaking in the classroom, but then also making sure that they would have 5 to 10 minutes at the end of a lesson where they may use translanguaging. So they may use a home language to be able to describe a big idea related to grammar, structure, patterns in language, something cultural about what they were doing. So we definitely want the kids to develop strong communicative literacy. And at the same time, sometimes we'll use translanguaging to make sure they have those opportunities to use their home language to look at the big ideas to support transfer. I hope that answers your question, Roxana. Okay, one last question. Let's see. Could you suggest strategies to develop concepts implicitly? So Carlos asked that question. I think what concept-based inquiry promotes is that we're explicit about developing concepts. And the reason for that is that we want our students to be aware of the ideas they're developing in the classroom and how they can apply them to new situations and contexts. I'll often talk to teachers and they'll say, oh, well, I'm already doing this. We already develop concepts because we do discussion-based strategies and we're talking about local or global issues, things like migration or culture. And I say, absolutely, they probably are. But how intentional is it and how aware are the learners that they're developing those ideas? As I showed in the slideshow, we want students to have quite a high level of self-awareness of the ideas they're developing. So I'm just going to go to this slide. These grade 2 students could tell you, yes, I developed all these ideas and my peers developed all these ideas in the unit. So our strategies will very often ask students to reflect on questions, which are conceptual questions. That means they're questions that are not at the factual level, like there won't be a question specifically about Diwali. The question will be about celebrations and about how celebrations perhaps contribute to the group's sense of community. So we ask big conceptual questions and we allow students to access their factual knowledge to be able to answer that. And they use that as evidence. So students may say, well, when we learned about Diwali, we learned that da-da-da-da-da. And when we learned about Eid, well, da-da-da-da-da. So now I understand about celebrations that, and then they have a big idea that represents the factual examples that they learned. And we would say, great, write it down either in your own notebook or on a slide that you have as a portfolio or on a big piece of paper that can be used in the classroom. We want to capture that big idea, and then we want to come back to it over time and say, does this still hold true? Do we need to change our thinking at all? Would we modify it? Would we add on? Have you found examples that reflect this? And what we're trying to do there is really show how the classroom learning reflects the world. Because we know we have that complexity. We want to make sure that students also see that the learning in the classroom really enables them to make sense of what's around them in their environment. All right, so I'll probably leave that for as my last question. We're
yeah, you've done
hour.
There's so many questions. You did so well to get through so many of them, Carla. Well done. However, I'll just step back to if you want to say goodbye or say any thank you to anything else.
Yeah. So thank you very much to everyone for the time today. Please have a look at the book. If you're interested in learning more, please read the position paper. I am on LinkedIn in case anyone wants to connect, and I really wish the best for a really successful rest of your conference.